Welcome to the 5-7 podcast. I'm your host, Pri, and today I've got Dan Pronk with me on the show. Dan, how you doing, man?
Yeah, good, Pri. Thanks for having me, mate.
Excellent, man. Thanks. We really appreciate you on the show. Dan wrote a book called Average 70 Kilogram Dickhead, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's I'm gonna leave the how you got the title for the book inside the book, so the readers can read that on their own. But what we're going to do today is we're going to do a book review of his book, and it's awesome. We're going to read a few passages, and he's going to give a little insight onto where he was at the time. So, yeah, man, we're going to leave out the we'll leave out the title, man, because I thought that part was really, really funny.
No, I appreciate that, and I mean the as you know, it's a story behind the titles in the first chapter there, but the gist of it was obviously meant to be a little bit attention grabbing and a bit tongue in cheek, but the gist of it is just the whole ethos of the book is about how, you know, average people, I hate the term average, but I mean, you know, the what society deems as an average person can achieve, you know, exceptional things. And for the most part, these people that we see, particularly on social media, are just average people that are doing these exceptional things because they've persisted and they've stuck with it. And so that was the whole ethos of the book, is just about how, well, myself as an average 70-kilo dickhead has managed to do a couple of above average things. And so that's basically the gist of the book, just breaking that down.
Hey, Dan, could you give a quick introduction of yourself, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I started off as just, you know, middle class sort of a kid, chubby kid at school, wasn't particularly good at anything. One older brother and normal Australian, if you hadn't picked up already, Australian sort of upbringing. My dad was an army helicopter pilot. Mum was a speech therapist, and so just sort of cruised through school, average grades, never particularly good at sport, did okay at things here and there, and then when I got out of school, I got a bit of an interest in triathlon. Towards the end of my high school, I'd become quite keen on middle distance running, and then that led to triathlon. And so for my first few years out of school, I tried to crack it as a professional triathlete. Didn't make it there. Had done a bit of university. Did an exercise science degree. Didn't really want to work in that, and so basically was at a crossroads in my early 20s where I needed to find a career, more or less. And so I ended up looking at the army. My brother had gone into the army, and so that was familiar to me. My dad was army, and I was looking at future study as well, to kind of use my exercise science as a bit of a launch pad to study something else. And the two of those things came together. I ended up getting an army scholarship to go and study medicine, and so became a doctor with the army. And then as that was all going on, my brother had gone into Special Forces. He'd joined a unit in the Australian Army called the Special Air Service Regiment. And so I had a look at that and decided that's what I wanted to do, and so dedicated a big chunk of my life to training towards the selection process for the SAS, and managed to get through that course in 2008, and then spent the 5 years after that serving with Australian Special Operations and doing a number of tours, including a handful to Afghanistan, and getting some good experience there. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I'm out the other end of my military career now, and have gone back to a civilian doctor role, and just slowly but surely reintegrating back into the civilian world.
Awesome, man. So the first, well, you know, the chapters aren't even numbered; they're just named, which is great. So and each title has a kind of has a bit of a narrative to the chapter, I think, which works really, really well with the read. And so this one is called "It Is Not the Critic Who Counts." Failure to see the truth behind this opening line, "It is not the critic that counts," is at the core of why many of us in this life never hit our goals, and why some of us never even set goals in the first instance. It is human nature to be influenced by what others think of us, especially those close to us. And sadly, it is also human nature for a lot of people to want to drag down the tall poppies among us. I guess this tendency stems from an inherent insecurity that many have, that is worsened by watching others rise above the level of performance that they are at. These people don't have the aptitude or drive to strive towards a goal themselves, so to retain their own sense of self-worth, it is crucial for them to do their best to dissuade others from pursuing self-improvement that will lead them to betterment. That way, everyone stays in their shitty level and they can feel equal and not inferior. The way that these people achieve this objective is through criticism of your goals and aspirations. And, that is absolutely huge, because I think that there's a ton of people out there that are, they're trying to make it, and they're trying to, make a difference in their lives. And I think that there's a point in everybody's life where, you need to kind of take that shot, you need to kind of, for lack of a better term, jump. And people don't. I mean, either they do or they don't. And, there is a chance that you won't be successful. And there's a chance that you will be successful. What do you think it is, like, inherently, that makes people want to put others down?
Well, I think ultimately we're all so comfortable in the first world. In this day and age, we don't have to force ourselves out of our comfort zone necessarily if we don't choose to. And I think many people are completely at peace with that. They cruise along. They might think that they want to strive for something. They might try towards a goal for a short period of time, and then when they really hit that grind and it gets hard, they just give up and go back to their comfortable existence. And I think, there's certainly people out there that, and I think most of us have the ideas in our head periodically, oh, geez, I'd love to do that, or I'd love to do this, I'd love to run a marathon or go and study a master's of something or other. But formulating that idea and then actually putting it into practice are two different things. And I think that, and it's all about the persistence and determination. And sadly, I feel that there's a bunch of people out there who are oftentimes keen to sort of try and cut those people down, and you see that. And I mean, that title, "It's Not a Critic That Counts," comes from that famous speech, "The Man in the Arena" by Theodore Roosevelt. And if you haven't heard that one, it's worth looking up. So, "The Man in the Arena" by Roosevelt, and that's the first line, is it's not the critic who counts, and then it goes on. It's a very motivational passage, and I think it's a great one. It's certainly fired me up over the years. But I do fear, and I've experienced it myself, unfortunately, in times when I've set a ambitious goal. And I think some of it, particularly the stuff, the criticism that comes from loved ones and people close to you, is well-intentioned. And I suspect it comes from these people who do actually care about you. They can see you setting a goal that they feel may not be achievable, or the chance of achieving it is remote. And so they're oftentimes, I think, trying to protect you from the disappointment or all the investment you put in to not hit that goal. So it may be that the criticism you get from loved ones is sometimes well-intentioned. However, oftentimes I think it's unfortunately the people that don't want to see someone else excel, because it will be highlighting the fact that they don't have the drive or persistence to strive for any goal themselves, and so they feel the need to cut you down. And I've certainly experienced that over the years, and it can be very influential on your own kind of determination. It can really, if you take it on board and really get bogged down in it, it can knock the motivation right out of your dreams. And so I guess it's important imperative to just sort of, listen to that criticism, try and ignore the stuff that's not worthwhile. If there's some little bits and pieces in there that might actually be worth considering and taking on board, particularly from people who are close to you and will be affected by your pursuit of a goal, then absolutely do that. But more and more, I sort of feel that it's and as Roosevelt says in his speech, it's not the critic that counts, and it's really not. It's as he also says, it's the bloke in the arena. So, try and put up a bit of armor against that criticism and just crack on and pursue your goals. And like you said before, I mean, ultimately, worst case is you don't hit what you're moving towards, and that can be a bit embarrassing. You get that feeling of failure, and that you'll get the "I told you so's" from the critics. But I think a worse outcome is to miss an opportunity to try and then reflect later in your life and think, geez, I wonder if I could have done this, wonder if I could have done that, wonder if I could have joined that special unit or ran a marathon or got a uni degree or what have you, and the window's closed. So I think that's a worse outcome.
In David Goggins' book, he has something called the accountability mirror, and I'm not sure if you've read his book or not.
Yeah,
but
I have. Yeah,
I do. I have like a somewhat like a similar term as well. I just say it, looking in the mirror. there comes a point in time when, you got to look in the mirror and you got to look at yourself, and either you like what you see or you don't like what you see. And I think when people are trying to take that next step, it forces the people around them to look in the mirror, and they don't like what they see, so they kind of tell them, it's a bad idea, what you're doing. In a way.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think you've got a couple of good points there. I mean, one is that accountability, and at the end of the day, you are only truly accountable to yourself, and so that's one part of it. But also, as you rightly point out, when someone close to you or in your social circle starts to strive towards something ambitious, it does make you have a look at yourself and think, geez, what am I doing with my life? And say, geez, that Goggins book, I mean, that is a real in-your-face book, isn't it? It's not a feel-good book, that's for sure. But
no, it's not.
What an incredible individual and hugely motivating. Yeah, it's a brilliant read.
Yeah, I also find that a lot of people, like a lot of military people, love it, and they can, they can understand, where he's coming from. And there's people like kind of on the outside of the military, they read it and then they really dig it, like they want to it motivates them. And then there's other people that are like, yeah, I like it, but that guy's crazy. He's hardcore. And if you really look at it, considered what he went through in his life, you could really understand, why he's so driven, and why he can't be, quote unquote average, which I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing to be average. I mean, if you want to be average, yeah, sure, that's cool. But just as long as you're not carrying down the people around you, Yeah,
you're absolutely spot on. And that's a point that I hope I convey clearly in the book is I'm not having a go at people that are comfortable in a average life. And I hate the term average. It sounds so derogatory. However, the people that are very comfortable to go about their 9-to-5 job, to have their 2 kids and 2 cars and a mortgage and what have you, that's great. If you're comfortable with that and if you're truly at peace with that, then that's brilliant. However, it's the ones that are in that sort of situation and living what we perceive as an average life in the first world, and then feel the need to put their opinion forward for others who are striving for a little bit more than that. The people like the Goggins of the world that are driven to really excel and feel that need. So yeah, if you're happy with what you've got, that's the gold standard. But if you're not, then either do something about it or don't pass opinion on those that are trying to rise a little bit above their current sort of spot.
Right. All right, on with the book. I dedicated the next 6 years of my life towards bettering myself, with the objective of completing the grueling SASR selection course. I completed my medical schooling, all the while pack marching hundreds of kilometers, month in, month out. I studied languages, I scuba dived, I rock climbed, I shot handguns and rifles, anything to improve myself in areas that I felt might improve my chances of being suitable for Special Forces service. All the while I stayed quiet about my aspirations, and aside from a few key people in my life who I knew would support me, I didn't tell a soul. Fast forward to 2007, and I had graduated from medical school, completed my compulsory medical internship, and a further year of civilian hospital experience, and I was a few months into my posting to my first Army unit. Despite having technically been in the Army for 6 years by that stage, all of that time I had been spent in civilian schooling and hospitals, so in effect I was only several months into proper military service. The first year in uniform was spent doing a series of basic introduction courses to learn how to behave as an Army officer, as well as apply my medical skill set to the Army environment. For all intents and purposes, I was a newbie, wet behind the ears. That was context, which I attended at my interview with my Army career advisor that year. Now, before we go on, I feel it's important to see this interaction from his perspective. From his side of the table, he would have seen me as a brand new baby Army doctor who was 30 seconds into his job and was yet to even complete the courses required to become employable in a full capacity in the role, let alone deployable. He didn't know me from a bar of soap, and certainly would have had no idea that I had spent the previous 6 years sharpening myself physically and mentally for Special Forces selection. Back to my side of the table. As I entered my interview, my initial impression of my career advisor was unimpressive. He was overweight, slumped in his chair, wearing his dress uniform poorly, and didn't rise from his seat to greet me. When I entered, he was, however, the person who could have a significant impact on my career. So I looked past my initial impression and pressed on with the start of the interview, trying to put my best foot forward. When asked what my intentions were for my career, I confidently informed him of my plan to do SASR selection and pursue a career with Special Forces. He had been eating his lunch while completing my interview, and it was at this point, with a mouthful of food, that he looked up at me in amused disbelief as to what he was hearing and began to draw a deep breath to laugh in my face. In doing so, he deeply inhaled a food particle from his mouth, which sent him into an explosive coughing fit that caused him to turn red and then purple, before finally clearing his airways enough to allow him to laugh directly into my face. He proceeded to crap all over my aspirations and let me know that I was sacrificing my opportunity to build a real career by chasing a pipe dream. I had never felt so humiliated in my life. I felt my face redden and my blood pressure rise. The blood vessels in my temples started to throb, and I actually felt tears well in my eyes. It was a horrible experience. Now, I picked this out because there are times in everybody's life where they feel that they have been completely, humiliated, and they're trying to do something, and something happens where they're completely humiliated, and they get to that edge on, what, this was a really bad idea. I can't believe that I did this, and either they turn back or that they keep on going. At this point, in your life, what made you want to keep going?
I think and you're spot on. I mean, that was a real tipping point of sorts for me, and I was by that stage so invested in my goal that there was nothing that was going to stop me attempting that course. Well, I guess ultimately if the Army hadn't let me on it or something like that, but I was absolutely hell-bent on having a go at SAS selection, and that was by that point. I mean, that was 2007, and I'd become aware of the unit in 2001 when I went over to visit my brother just before his first deployment to Afghanistan. So that was at the end of 01, not long after the September 11. And I saw what went on at the unit. It opened my eyes to everything Special Forces that I'd previously had no real concept of at all, to be honest. And then so I used that opportunity while I was finishing up my medical schooling and my junior doctor time to train towards it, basically, to do anything that I could that I thought would improve my chances of getting into Special Forces. And so by the time I had that career interview, and as I'd try and convey in the passage that you just read, I mean, I'm turning up to this career interview, and the career advisor is seeing me as a brand new Army doctor, which is what I was. And I guess he would have heard a million times before people sitting in front of him saying, I want to be Special Forces. And the reality is the attrition rate on any selection course is significant. It is more likely that you're going to fail, and the people that are generally successful come from a soldiering background. They've got some soldiering skills, and here I was as a doctor that had just finished my civilian medical qualification, a couple of junior years in hospitals, and then I was only 6 months into a unit at a health support battalion doing my induction courses, and here I am telling him that I want to do SAS selection. So I can certainly see it from his perspective, and his response was probably pretty much the appropriate one. However, at that stage, I guess I was probably looking for some validation from him, which I with hindsight, I was probably never going to get, because what I was proposing wasn't, from his perspective, a great idea, and the chance of success was probably pretty slim. But also, by that same token, he wouldn't have had the concept that I had been doing so much training, was so invested in that goal. So fortunately, I was psychologically so determined to hit that goal that what ended up happening after that interaction with the career advisor, where he was sort of adamant that this wasn't going to be successful, that it actually strengthened my resolve. So I got out of that, and sort of after I settled down a little bit, thought, well, I'm going to use that as rocket fuel, and I am going to train my ass off towards this to prove this guy wrong. And so, I guess it was a bit spiteful, but it really supercharged my motivation. But if I hadn't have been as invested in the goal as I was, that response from a person in that position in the construct could have quite easily have made me just, quit on my goals. And I think a lot of people, exactly as you mentioned, Pre, they will hit a crucial point where they've got a goal and they've been maybe keeping it to themselves, working towards it, and then they go to someone who they want external validation from, and they get that negative, no, that's a terrible idea, you'll never be able to do it, and so they might be inclined to walk away from it. So I guess if you have any ambitious goals, you will hit these points, and if they're people that are peripheral to it and they don't matter, that goes back to what we were talking about before. They're the critics that just don't count and can be ignored. But if it's coming from someone who actually is important, a loved one, a boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, a family member, or in this instance a career advisor who's the bloke who's ultimately needed to put my name down for stuff to influence my military career, then that's a real tough one. So when they start criticising you, that can have a real impact, and it can go either way. It can either make you walk away from your goal or strengthen your resolve. And fortunately for me, I was invested enough that just was rocket fuel for my motivation, and I used that every time I was struggling when I was training, getting up at 3 a.m. to go pack marching in the pouring rain. I'd be thinking of that bloke and just think, well, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to prove you wrong.
How old were you at that point?
I was 30.
Okay, so then you were pretty comfortable with who you were pretty much as a guy then.
Yeah, look, I think that's another factor. I mean, I came into the Army, so by the time I'd done my triathlon thing, I did that for about 5 years when I got out of school and did my first degree part-time. So I think I was about 23, 24 before I even entered into the Army. And then I had that period where I was doing my medical school and then my junior doctor years. So, yeah, you're quite right. I wasn't an 18, 19-year-old kid. I was a young man with a bit of life experience working in hospitals as a junior doctor. And so I guess that also helped me to just put perspective on it and just look at this bloke and be able to rationalise what he was saying, be able to see it from his perspective, and then make a decision. Hey, I hear what you're saying, I take your doubt on board, and now I'm going to prove you wrong.
Moving on, the fight and the dog. I was on the officer component of my Special Forces selection course, and I found myself right back there in the pit of self-doubt. I was completely out of my comfort zone, being an inexperienced Army doctor lined up against dozens of experienced Army infantry officers, many of whom had multiple operational tours of Iraq and some with experience commanding troops in battle. One of the activities that we were required to do was called Rate Your Mate, and it involved the 30 or so officers left of the course, by that stage organizing ourselves into what we decided was an order of best to worst candidate. As you can imagine, there was a fair bit of ego involved in the upper echelon, and even some physical jostling for the top positions. Officers got in all sorts of squabbles with one another to justify why they felt they were more deserving of a higher position than the man next to them. Surprisingly, some seemed quite comfortable to settle at the bottom end of the pecking order without a fight. I placed myself right in the middle of the group, plumb in the center of the bell curve. When we had finished organizing ourselves, we were left in 3 groups of about 10, being a top dog group, the middle group, in which I was situated, and the bottom group of 10. What was interesting about this exercise was that the groups could have almost been allocated based on physical stature alone, with the top group exclusively the tall, muscular soldiers that the general public would envision as what a Special Forces soldier would look like. The middle group was officers of average to below average height and build such as myself, and the bottom group was made up of wiry, more insecure-looking officers with a couple sets of Coke bottle glasses thrown among them for good measure. As the course progressed, one by one, the officers from the top group quit at a rate that far exceeded those from the bottom and middle group. When we reached the end of the grueling 3-week course, only 1 or 2 of the top group remained, with the majority of successful officers coming from the bottom group in the Rate Your Mate exercise. This was a phenomenon that I continued to observe over many subsequent selection courses that I supported as a doctor, and after many years of pondering, it now makes perfect sense to me. You see, the alpha male top dog soldiers who arrange themselves towards the pointy end of the pecking order are the types who have excelled throughout their lives, often on the sporting field, academically, and probably with the ladies. Things have come easily to them, and through a combination of genetics and natural talent, they have oftentimes been able to achieve at a high level with minimal to moderate levels of training or study. Society has held them in high esteem, and their ego has been allowed to develop accordingly. In the Army Special Forces selection scenario, they have usually come from the elite elements of their regular Army units, being either sniper or reconnaissance elements, and junior officers and soldiers alike look up to them. All of a sudden, they find themselves on a course where they are treated like shit around the clock, and everything they say or do is met with a barrage of humiliating abuse. Their competence is questioned at every opportunity, and after every one of their efforts and exertions, they are told they were not equal to the task. There is a method to the madness behind the psychological barrage of the Special Forces selection process, but to the ego-driven top-dog soldier, this situation is completely foreign and so overwhelmingly confronting that the majority of them cannot handle it and withdraw from the course at own request to return to the comfort of their previous units where their social status is already established. In stark contrast to the top dogs, were the soldiers who find themselves in the bottom ranks of the rate your mate type exercises. These are the ones who never excelled at anything in their youth, and for who any success in life has come entirely through sheer grit and dog determination. They have forced their bodies and minds to transcend their genetic or social boundaries, to excel in the face of what the universe appeared to have mapped out for them. Many have dug themselves out of the rut of lower socioeconomic disadvantage or a troubled upbringing to not only reach a level playing field with those around them, but to show the world that despite their genetics and past, that they can excel. Most will have been bullied to some degree at school, and you can guarantee they were never the cool kid. In my opinion, it is likely that that have been bullied places a chip on their shoulder and the fire in their belly to prove a point to those who bullied them by doing something exceptional with their lives. I suspect that either consciously or subconsciously, the effect of that school bullying is what drives many of these people to be able to log the years of hard study, training, or both required to claw their way to the top. This is huge because, when you everywhere in life or anywhere you go, in school, somewhere, there's always somebody who's at the top where it seems like things come easy to them, and that you're never going to be as good as them, or you'll never be as strong as them, or as fast as them, or as smart as them. And people sell themselves short a lot. But a lot of those people who do sell themselves short, or, they tend to persevere through that, they're the people who wind up being there at the end because, like the guy who always gets the girl, or the guy who's always, on top and it's easy for him. They don't understand what it is to persevere, and they don't understand what it takes to get to that point. When you were in the middle of this, like at the beginning, did you feel that, like, oh God, man, look at these guys are going to kill it, and we're going to, oh God, who knows what we're going to do? Like what was your mindset at the time?
Yeah, for sure. So when I remember on the first day of selection, when we got into our first PT session, and just thinking, what have I done? This, looking around and just getting completely psyched out, looking at these other 6.5 foot tall super soldier looking blokes, and just thinking, I am in the wrong place. I've bitten off more than I can chew here. And it was a habit that I had when I was a triathlete as well. I always seemed to psych myself out and convince myself that I wasn't as well trained or as physically capable as the bloke next to me. And I do think a degree of self-doubt is healthy. I think to not have any self-doubt and to be overly confident and cocky is dangerous, and you're setting yourself up for a fall. However, the flip side of that is if you don't have any self-belief whatsoever, it's hard to really stretch yourself and get towards goals. But I think erring on the side of a bit of self-doubt is always good. And I think exactly what you're saying there talks to the heart of the resilience type debate. And if you're cruising through school and your junior life as a young adult and that period of time, and you're physically, you're a big person, or you're a strong person, or you're intellectually you're smarter than the next guy, and you don't have to work as hard. You're not getting that opportunity to build the resilience that you can get if you're the bloke who's struggling, who's having to work really hard to keep up with grades, who's having to bust their ass and train 2 times a day instead of 1 to keep up on the sporting field, these kind of things, or the one getting bullied at school. And, that's a terrible scenario. However, it does build resilience. There's no two ways about it. And I guess we spoke about David Goggins earlier and some of the horrendous things that went on in his early life that just absolutely sharpened that bloke and made him sort of rock hard to the point where he can do what he does now. And that's an extreme example, but I think there is some merit, whilst you don't wish it on any kid, but there is some merit in having a degree of challenge and building a degree of resilience in your younger life. And fast forwarding to the passage you just read, and that interesting observation on my own selection course and then on other courses that I was involved with, supporting them down the track and watching it all happen. That was a consistent theme, that you'd see these big super soldier looking guys, and at the start you'd look at your group of 150 soldiers and think, what, that guy looks like he should be in this unit. And it was almost always your eye was drawn to the big, strong blokes. But over the time that I was involved with the selection process, I would see that theme over and over again, that it was the smaller blokes, the more wiry blokes, the more insecure blokes that hadn't had an exceptional military career to date. They were the ones that seemed to do better. They could take that and I mentioned the term barrage, and I think it's a good one. It's an absolute psychological assault, a selection course, and it's designed to be. I mean, it's physically very challenging, but the physical stuff, in my opinion, is just designed to wear a soldier down so that you can see their psychological makeup. And this is where the resilience comes in, and you get these wiry little tough guys that have got this never quit attitude, whereas some of the blokes who have had things come easier in life, don't have that same resilience. And when it comes down to it, and they're cold and they're tired and they're hungry, and everyone's sleep deprived, and you're getting yelled at, and they just can't take it. Their ego is challenged, and they can't take it. I mean, there's always exceptions to this rule, and you do get these 6.5 foot tall, brick shithouse super soldiers that have got that resilience, and they are a formidable force, and they're the blokes you want by your side, absolutely. So, I mean, it's not exclusive, but in my experience, they generally fell off the course at a faster rate than the smaller, wirier blokes, which was surprising.
There are some of those guys out there that's like, yeah, you're exactly his build.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I mean, you can't compete with that. And I found that in my triathlon experience. I found that I was doing the best I could, and ultimately I was training with some of the best guys in the world and doing the same stuff as them, and they were just head and shoulders above me. And it came down, I think, to a degree of genetics there. And these were guys, and also mindset. I look back now, and I was in my early 20s, I was mentally weak. I really was, compared to the sort of levels of mental strength that I was able to achieve later in my life. But I think, when you're stacking up against it, if you can get that perfect combination of genetics and physical sort of strength, and then that resilience and mindset, then, that's your super soldier right there.
It's kind of funny, when you're like 19, 20, I think like, every kid has like that, yeah, I think we can do it kind of mentality. And then by the time you hit 24, I think that you should have that mentality where you're like, what, we're going to get it done, and that's it. It doesn't matter what it is. Let's just go and get it done. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And I fear that we're losing that a little bit as a society, and I fear that that resilience, and I guess it's generationally, we're going to change, of course, and I'm different generationally to where my parents were at the same age and stage, and that's how it is, and you've got to move with it. But I guess that just that growing up outdoors, I mean, I grew up pre-internet, which my kids can't fathom. They sort of look at me funny when I tell them we didn't even have the internet when I was their age, and it's a different world now. But I fear that we're losing that, that childhood spent in the woods or down the creek and climbing trees and riding bikes and all that outdoor stuff, scuffing your knees, breaking your arm, all that stuff that was a bit of a rite of passage. And this day and age, we're more inclined for our kids to stay inside. They're on iPads and on screens, and that's all important stuff. That's the way of the future. They need to be able to access and work with those modalities, but by the same token, we're leading more and more comfortable lives as a generalisation, and losing that breeding of the physical resilience that you can get from being outdoors.
I agree with you 110%. And I think that it comes down to failure. Because as you grow older, you, at least when you're young, you need to fail. And there needs to be some kind of a learning experiment there, because when you fail, you need to understand that that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of what you're doing. This is just the beginning. And take what you've learned from here and move on. Maybe it wasn't meant to be at this time, but you gave a concerted effort. What's there to learn from here, and move on? And I think that the problem is that kids don't know how to accept specifically failure and then moving on from it.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think failure is a crucial part of exactly everything you're saying. But also, if you're not failing, then it's an indication that you're not testing the limits. You're working so well within your comfort zone that you're not giving yourself the chance to not achieve an objective, and that's not a great thing. And I guess, once again, coming back to kids these days, and I'm kind of torn on this issue. There's a bit of a move towards things like school sport being less competitive and not keeping score, so you don't have winners and losers, so that you don't have kids, walking away from it. And inherently I look at that and I think, geez, you know what? You need to learn to lose, and you need to keep score, because, well, guess what? When you get out of school, society keeps score, and it's not it's not kind of equal opportunities for everyone. But by that same token, with 3 young kids myself now, you don't want them to just constantly be demoralised by not winning and not having that opportunity to feel like they're excelling and progressing themselves. So it is a tough one, but I think you're quite right. I think failure is important, and throughout your life as well. I mean, I think as we kind of hit middle age, which sadly I'm approaching now, you can get very comfortable and you can get stuck in your routine and stuck in your rut, for want of a better term. And I think it's important to keep just pushing those boundaries and setting goals and to keep failing, because that's what keeps you motivated, works out where your limits are, what you can and can't achieve.
You included one of my favorite quotes in your book, and it's by Calvin Coolidge, and it reads, "Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent." When did you read that for the first time?
Oh, gee, it would have been my early 20s, I imagine, when I was sort of coming out of my triathlon days. I started to read a bit more widely, and I'd grown up. My mum and dad were pretty big on a lot of Rudyard Kipling's type stuff. If is a good example of that. And we had Max Ehrmann's Desiderata is another fantastic motivational passage. And I've mentioned the Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena. So these were things that were up around our house and we had access to growing up. And of course you're reading them as a kid, and we had Desiderata on the back of our dunny door, and so I was reading that from the earliest age, and you can't make sense of it. But as I went along and revisited it got more and more meaning. And then once you've got a bit of life experience, you can reflect on these things. But gee, that quote that you just read by Coolidge is just so true and so relevant. And you look at, I think, a great example for most of us sort of hitting your 30s and 40s is you look back at people from school, and maybe the people that were excellent at things at school on the sporting field academically. And certainly in my experience, not many if any of those have gone on to excel in adulthood, and you look at those who weren't particularly good at stuff but just kept chipping away at it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and these are the people that are excellent. And I mean, which is great for all of us average 70 kilo dickheads out there, because you know, if you just hang in there long enough, the field starts to trim out, so there's attrition there. So if you're still standing, you're still in the game, and it's incredible how, if you are willing just to persist and knuckle down and dedicate yourself towards a goal long beyond the time when it's exciting and shiny and new and you've written your SMART goal and you're really motivated, you know, long after the New Year's resolution kind of, you know, you're hitting February, March, and it's no longer seems that much fun. But I mean, that's the grind and that's the persistence, and that's what is rewarded ultimately.
You mentioned your SMART goal, and that means specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time limited. Could you go over that briefly?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess with any goal setting, and I mentioned it before, a lot of time people will think about, geez, I'd love to do this, I'd love to do that, and then it'll pretty quickly they might have half a go at it, go for a couple of training runs, and then realise, I can't run a marathon or something along those lines, or we might want to lose some weight, but unless you're really specifically mapping out a plan, and I mean, the analogy that gets used, I used it in the book, and I think it's a really good one, is like a road trip in a car. And so you know where your destination is, and then you map out the towns you have to go through, you map out where you're going to have to get fuel, you put air in your tires, you do this, you do that, you get food, so that, or you're going to stop here for lunch, I'll stop there. And so it's, you know, when you're doing a road trip, we inherently do this, and it's the same with a lot of other goals in our life. You know, we will break them down and work out how we're going to go about it. So break it down into small parts. But when you're setting a life goal, a lot of us think, geez, I'd love to lose some weight, or I'd love to run a marathon, or I'd love to get a university education. But that's where it ends, and you're not really giving yourself that roadmap from where you're at now to where you want to be. And so if you start with those 2 points and then start applying that SMART goal process, so exactly as you said, specific is the first part there. So rather than saying, hey, I'd love to lose some weight, you need to quantify that, and that plays into the next one, which is measurable. So, you know, specifically, I want to lose 10 kilos. There you go. And then that's measurable. You can work that out. That's an absolute value. Achievable and realistic are other things that are important. You need to really look hard at what you're trying to achieve and what your goal is, and really sort of soul search and say, hey, is this achievable for me, or is this realistic, or is this just pie in the sky stuff? And that's the difference between an actual goal and then just a pipe dream. And so that does require a bit of soul searching there, and that can play into modifying what your goal is if you realise that isn't going to be achievable. If you want to run a marathon, and this is another thing with the SMART process, you need to review your goals as you go along. And so it may be that you want to run a marathon, as you go along, your knee starts to flare up, and you get a scan and you realise you've got some meniscal damage, and you know your doc says, hey, you're not going to be able to do any impact sport. And so that's going to sort of shoot your marathon goal in the foot. But then you might be able to kind of have a look at it, some cycling, some low impact, a swimming race, something like that. And so it's all about just looking at your goals, making sure they're achievable and realistic, and then time limited is the other one. So you got to put an end point on that. And a sporting event's a good one, because that's often, you know, I want to run the Boston Marathon or whatever your goal might be, and you know when that is. But if it's something that's a bit less tangible than that, if it's, say, a weight loss goal, and I know I'm sort of drawing on those two examples, but they're not bad ones. So you might set yourself a 6-month time frame to lose your 10 kilos, and then or say 6 months to lose your 10 kilos. Yeah, you can break that down and work out how much you need to lose roughly each month, each week, and that just makes it these little bite-sized pieces that you can chip away at, rather than that overarching goal, which might seem a bit overwhelming. So break it down into small, manageable bite-sized goals, and start hitting those, and then that starts to give you a bit of motivation, shows that you can achieve it, and starts to move towards that bigger goal. And if you just persist, then you'll get there.
pretty much the recipes for success right there.
Yeah.
Rack on. I'm a massive fan of contemporary movement of random acts of kindness. I believe there's a certain satisfaction that you get from performing a selfless act for someone else without any expectation of something in return that's hard, if not impossible, to get from other means. There are a couple of great mantras that come in mind when I think of Rack, the first of which comes from John Bunyan and reads, "You have not lived today until you have done something for someone who can never repay you." The second great passage that springs to mind when I think about the topic of Rack is the poem "Have You Earned Your Tomorrow" by Edgar Guest, which opens with the line, "Is anybody happier because you passed his way?" and closes with, "As you close your eyes in slumber, do you think that God would say, 'You have earned one more tomorrow by the work you did today'?" By work in this poem, Guest is referring to selfless efforts to help those around us, rather than self-serving acts with expectation of reward or favor. With hindsight, my dad, who was a very kind and generous man, exposed me to Rack from the earliest age. While we were never flush with cash growing up, we certainly had plenty to get by, and Dad never hesitated to share when he could. I vividly recall multiple occasions when Dad would pick up hitchhikers on long highway trips, and when he dropped them off, would often give them all the cash he had in his wallet at the time, and simply because he knew that they needed it more than he did. Sometimes the hitchhikers would try and make a plan to repay the money or attempt to get Dad's details, which Dad would always decline, suggesting that they could potentially repay the favor to someone else in need in the future. Now, I think that that's absolutely huge, because I believe in the same thing. To do something to help somebody honestly, and for them to repay you by passing it on down the road. And that's huge, because it starts off not like a he helped me because I've fallen down type of thing. I mean, it could be, but which seems insignificant to us, but that person could be having like the worst day ever, and you helping pick that person up, could be the world of difference, where, they don't feel the burden as much anymore, that they know that there's hope out there. Do you have any stories to share of you maybe giving somebody a helping hand?
Oh, look, I mean, couldn't agree more. I think this, as I've gone on in life and sort of become more mature and had kids myself and had my dad pass away, I've thought more and more of this. And I mean, it's part of, I think it's what makes us human, and I think it's a big factor in feeling fulfilled. And you look at some of the social psychologists, Maslow and a couple of others along those similar lines, that talk about self-fulfillment and self-actualization, and most of those will mention a degree of contributing to society as being a fundamental part of reaching your fullest potential. And it's interesting when you start to look at it, and I think as young people, most of us are fairly self-centered and are only interested in, something that has a benefit. You won't go out of your way to do an effort for someone else that you're not going to see a reward for. And I think most kids are plumbed that way. Geez, I know that mine are, and it kills me. And I think maybe even as you get into your late teens, early 20s, for the most part, people are relatively self-centered and looking for some form of reward for any effort. But then I do think that most of us, as we hit our 30s, 40s, and particularly as you have your own kids, and inherently it's all about delivering something to someone else. But they're your kids, so that's expected. That's part of being a parent. It's how it is. But I've found over the years, and in terms of specifics, I mean, there's a lot that I can think of when I've had opportunities, and I see it as a real privilege to help people out. And in the medical field, you get that opportunity often, which is a nice way to be. People are coming to see you, particularly in the emergency department environment, when they're having a bad day. Things are going horribly wrong. They're injured, they're sick, they're frightened, or they might be a parent that's got a kid that's sick, severe asthma or something, struggling to breathe, and they can't help them. And as a parent, that's a horrendous feeling. And so to be able to be that doctor there who can just help someone out is a real privilege, and I think something that shouldn't be taken lightly. I guess that's not really a random act of kindness in that's kind of your job, but I think moving forward from that, just taking those opportunities, becoming aware and seeing those opportunities to be able to just help someone out is huge and part of being human. And I think I used the example a couple of times in the book of just giving cash to homeless people or strangers or these kind of things. And there's another example where our family has a tradition of buying a bike for a thing called the wishing tree. So it's around Christmas time. It's you can buy presents and put them under a tree at a local department store, and they get given to a boy or girl. You can pick what gender and what age, and that's it. And then you leave the gift there. And that stems from just my absolute love of riding bikes and my vivid memory of getting my first bike as an 8-year-old, which is actually kind of late to have a bike, to be honest. But at the time, it was what it was. And I got this bike and just absolutely loved it. And so the thought there is that hopefully one of these, these bikes can find their way to another 8-year-old kid who otherwise wouldn't have had that opportunity. And I think that just that pleasure of giving and knowing that you'll never get anything in return, knowing that you're never even going to find out where that gift ends up or anything along those lines, but just knowing that you've done something because you could to try and help someone else out who hasn't got it as good as you do. And I think that ties in as well to gratitude and just being very consciously appreciative of what we have, and I've been, I guess, lucky enough to have my eyes opened by my experiences in war zones to just how bad things can be. And then you come back to your comfortable first world existence and you start to realise, geez, I've got it really good. And then you think, well, how can I do my small part to help someone else out who may not be going as well in life as I'm lucky enough to be.
The bikes are such a great gift because, as a kid, when you first learn how to ride a bike, you really feel like maybe like freedom in a way,
Oh, freedom is the exact correct term for it. And I still remember vividly. So, that is 34 years ago now. And I can remember that experience vividly, first learning to ride that bike, right. And then that feeling of speed and absolute freedom as I was sort of ripping up and down a little street as a kid. And yeah, that's etched into my brain. And bikes were a huge part of my life when I got into the triathlon thing. Spent, countless hours thrashing out thousands of kilometres on push bikes. So it was a big part of my life. But that first experience learning to ride a bike and that first getting the feel of the balance of the bike is something that's etched into my memory. And yeah, to think that I might be able to play a small part in facilitating that for another kid, it really brings me a lot of pleasure.
This is the last part that I'm going to read of your book because, like I said, I want to leave a lot of it for everyone else to read because it's really a great read. This is called Don't Leave Any Rounds in the Magazine. The event occurred on a section of the course involving a 5-day individual navigation exercise compromising long-distance hikes in a national park between checkpoints at the tops of mountains while carrying a very heavy pack. The real challenge of the exercise was a psychological one, that we were provided no indication as to how much distance we needed to cover or how many checkpoints we needed to reach to pass the activity. We were left completely to our own devices and needed to pace ourselves to cover as much or as little ground as we felt reasonable, all the while keeping in mind the fact that there was a further 5 days of this selection course to go afterwards. We were under strict instructions not to interact with the other candidates during the activity, and for the most part the individual routes between checkpoints that we had all allocated meant that full days could pass without seeing another candidate anyway. I had crossed paths with a few others the first couple of days, and we had played by the rules and given one another nothing more than a nod of acknowledgement before proceeding on our separate ways. On the morning of the final day of the activity, I bumped into another candidate in a deep creek line. I was moving along and figuring that the chance of getting caught was slim. took the chance to have a quick chat. The topic of that discussion centered on how much distance we had both covered and how many checkpoints we had hit. During the conversation, the other candidate told me with a decent degree of conviction that a minimum of 5 checkpoints were required to pass the activity, and without really questioning the authenticity of his information, I took it as gospel. We wrapped up our conversation and parted ways, leaving me to ponder my situation. I had hit 4 checkpoints by that point, and my 5th was at the very top of a mountain some 20 kilometers away. We were under instruction not to move after dark, which left me with about 7 hours to get to it. By that stage, we were a couple of weeks into the selection course, and my body was starting to show some wear and tear. I had strained one of my quadricep muscles quite badly, and it was giving me hell with every step. I had started to lose a considerable amount of weight from the intense physical exertion of the course and the limited food provided. My physical deterioration was starting to take a toll on my psychological state, and for the first time on the course, I was having moments of mental weakness and doubt. I trudged along throughout the rest of the final day of the activity and was approaching the base of the mountain that my 5th checkpoint sat atop as the sun started to get low on the horizon. By that time, I had resigned myself to the fact that I wouldn't make it to the checkpoint before dark, and I had decided to set up camp at the base of the mountain for the night and radio in my location for the scheduled pickup the following morning. In the final few hundred meters of stomping towards the base of the mountain, another candidate came charging up from behind without me noticing and drew level with me. Scaring the life out of me as he did so, it turned out that his next checkpoint was the same one as mine, but unlike me, his attitude was positive, and despite acknowledging that he was going to make the checkpoint before dark, he was going for it anyway. He urged me to do the climb with him, but I was mentally defeated at the time, and when we hit the start of the track leading up the mountain, I wished him the best of luck and then found a place to camp for the night and drop my pack. Although I had made my decision to quit, something inside of me didn't allow me to unpack my kit to set up camp. As I sat there dejected, I turned my gaze to the other candidate in the distance, making his way up the climb to the checkpoint. As the sun began to set, I ran all the years of training that had led up to that point through my mind, and as I did so, it occurred to me that they had all led to that moment, and I was in the very process of giving up on my dream. I had this sickening realization that everything that I had worked so hard for and all the sacrifices I had may have been all for nothing if I didn't at least give that final climb a crack. My 5th checkpoint was less than a kilometer away, albeit all uphill. I wouldn't get there before dark, but I'd rather take a beating from an angry SAS soldier at the checkpoint for moving after dark than live the rest of my days knowing that I'd let myself down by quitting on my dream. I slung my pack back onto my aching shoulders, and with my lungs and legs burning, I made the best pace I was capable of up the mountain track as the light faded. As it got darker and darker, I got more and more frantic, stumbling on the rocky track underfoot as I raced toward the summit. The close foliage surrounding the track grabbing my shoulders and pack as I plowed on. By the time the track leveled out, I neared the checkpoint. I was in a trance-like state, fueled by the endorphins that my body was spewing out in response to the extreme exertion of the climb and the pain from my strained quadricep muscle. I paused for an instant to catch my breath and focus my eyes through the darkness to see the faint glow of the light at the checkpoint. With absolutely nothing left to lose, I made my way to the checkpoint, and bracing for the worst, I announced myself to the directorial staff there. Without any emotion whatsoever, he proceeded to radio in to the higher command that I had reached the checkpoint, and then he promptly dismissed me, instructing me to set up camp nearby and to make my way back down to the base of the mountain in the morning for pickup. Did you at that point think to yourself, you know what, I'm not even going to set up camp, I'm just going to crash right here?
Yeah, I didn't make it far. Actually, that DS on the top of the mountain, he was one of those 6.5 foot super soldiers that we spoke of before, and he turned out in the end to become Australia's most highly decorated soldier. So he was a real man mountain and a real sort of scary dude to look at, but lovely bloke once you got to know him. But certainly intimidating for a candidate on the selection course. But yeah, he actually invited me to camp next to him up on the top of the mountain. He said, "Oh, you know, it's dark. Throw up your stuff here." I said, "Oh, thanks, but no thanks, sir. I'll make my way a bit of the way. I didn't want to be anywhere near him." To be honest. terrified of him. But yeah, look, I mean, that was a real turning point on that course for me. And I mentioned earlier that my resolve was really strong towards getting on that course, and then it was a 3-week course, and that was within 5 days. So it was about day 16, 17, somewhere along there, and it was the first time that my mind threatened to quit on me. I was absolutely buggered. I was getting to the base of that climb. I knew that I wasn't going to get there after dark, and it was my mind sort of, and my body just screaming at my mind to quit, and I'd made that decision. And on reflection, I'm not sure how it would have played out if that other candidate hadn't have turned up and almost, guilted me into doing it in a way. But he was just so positive, and he must have been as knackered as I was at that point, and as broken. Everyone was injured and tired and had lost weight. It was just a fact of life, and he was just the absolute opposite of my mental state at the time. He's like, I'm going for this, and he did, and so I sat there and watched him for a little bit, and then, as you read, I had that horrid realization, you know what, I'm sitting here, my checkpoint's up there. If I don't do this, and this is why I get kicked off the course, then I'm going to forever regret this. And so I made that decision, and I'm really glad I did, to just crack on, give it a go. Worst case scenario, I get to the top and the DS yells at me or says doesn't count because it's after dark, but that's a better outcome than spending the rest of my days wishing I had of. And to this day, I've got no idea whether getting that additional checkpoint had any bearing or not, or whether I could have just camped at the bottom and I'd done enough to pass the activity. I'm not sure, but it was a turning point on that course in that I'd pushed myself to a level beyond the point that I'd ever pushed myself before, physically or psychologically, in my entire life. That was the sort of hardest I'd ever had to work physically, and more importantly psychologically. And it just, in terms of being on the course, that was a point at which I said, I'm not breaking, mentally. I will not be broken on this course. I'm going to keep pushing. They can either remove me or my body will break and I won't be able to physically go on, and they will be acceptable outcomes. But for me to quit on an activity, or heaven forbid, remove myself from the course, was completely unacceptable. And so it was a bit of a pivotal point, and it's one of those things in life. And there's a great book called The Dip by a marketer called Seth Godin, and he talks about just in general with regards to when you set a goal, and I mentioned it earlier, and everything's new and shiny, your goal's brand new, and you're motivated for the first days, weeks towards your goal, and then you hit this dip, this sort of period where you're thrashing it out, and the shine comes off it, and it's just hard work. It's early mornings, late nights. If it's a physical goal, it's physically taxing. You're sore, you're worn out, you need to stretch and recover and train and all that sort of stuff. Eat well if you're trying to physical goal or a weight loss goal, and it's in that period of the dip where that's where the persistence comes in, and then the temptation will be to quit at some point because you're not seeing the immediate results. You can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. You're making minuscule gains towards it. It might be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and this is where a lot of people will quit on their goals. But you never know when you're just a tiny bit off achieving that ultimate goal. So there's times where you just got to hang in there a little bit longer, and I guess that's where the persistence, the mindset comes into play. And with this particular instance, that was I just got to crack on, do my very best, and fortunately that other bloke gave me the motivation to do just that. And sadly he reached the end of the course, so I had the opportunity to bail him up at the end of the course and say, geez, thanks for giving me that motivation. And I'll let him know that he'd inspired me to do that climb and then finish the course. And whilst he got to the end, he wasn't picked up for service with the unit, so I lost track of him after that. But it was a real pivotal moment on that course for me, and the one where I decided that I was going to grit my teeth and hang in there. But it's the same in life when you're working towards any ambitious goal. Sometimes you're never quite sure when success might be just around the corner, and you just got to hang in there until you either hit that success or until it is physically impossible. You know, if you've got an entrepreneurial startup and you run out of cash, then that's it. But I mean, if you give up on your startup when you've still got 10 grand in the bank because you think, geez, I could really use with that 10 grand, then you might just be giving up the second before an investor turns up and bails you out, or you hit it big if you're trying to develop something. So that's where that whole "don't leave any rounds in the magazine" comes from.
At what point did you decide, you know what, I think I'm going to write a book?
I'd written a manuscript before that's never been published, and it was just surrounding my events, the events of my times, particularly some of the traumatic events of my times in Afghanistan, where we had soldiers killed and mates of mine that I couldn't save on the ground out there. And that had stemmed from, I'd actually come back from one rotation where we lost 3 blokes in pretty quick succession. And in my post-deployment psych debrief, I was just running through the scenario, and the psych said, hey, look, you know, might be a good idea to write down as much detail as you can about these events, just to get it straight in your head, to kind of get it down on paper, to process the events. And so it was as a bit of a cathartic psych type exercise that I started writing properly, and that ended up being a really good activity for me. And that what started as just trying to get some thoughts together turned into a 150,000 word book that I wrote, covering my time leading up to the military and then on deployment, and nothing's ever come of that. It's got too much sort of sensitive content to be releasable, but it got me interested in the writing side of things, and then I became interested in blogging and social media. And when I was with Special Operations, of course, we couldn't have a social media presence at all, so I was very late to the social media game, and didn't have a Facebook or Instagram account until I was 37 or 38 or something like that. So it was pretty foreign to me. But I became very interested in the military towards the end of my career in instructing, and in a medical capacity, I do a lot of instructing, doing lots of talks and presentations and these kind of things, lessons learned. And so I had a real interest in that area, and then that joy of writing kind of occurred to me when I wrote that manuscript as that cathartic exercise. And then when I started engaging in social media post my military career, it was very much about how I could try and take some of my experiences and lessons learned, oftentimes the hard way, and then, you know, try and get them out there with the goal of maybe trying to help someone else out. And a degree of that came from when I was training up towards Special Forces selection, wanted to be a doctor in that environment. I'd gone looking for mentors, and I found a couple of really exceptional ones who gave me the time of day and gave me motivation and replied to my emails. And so the thought occurred to me that I might be in the privileged position where I can offer that to someone else. And so I started trying to put a few lessons learned out on social media, particularly Instagram, and that seemed to be well received. And so there was themes that were coming through in my social media posts that seemed to resonate more than others. And basically the idea of Average 70 Kilo Dickhead was just elaborating on some of those themes, sort of grabbing them and stretching them out a bit more than you can on an Instagram post. And that was the motivation behind putting that out.
Do you have another book in the works?
Yeah, look, I've always got another book in the works. I'm one of these people that's always got about 10 harebrained bloody plans on the go at any given time, and 3 startup companies, and yeah. So, but yeah, look, I've been knocking together a few bits and pieces. I've become very interested in the last 6 to 12 months in cold water immersion, in ketogenic diets, in mindfulness and meditation, in the resilience in general. And I really think there's a lot there. And coming back, I mean, to excelling in any field in life, but particularly special forces, I look at how most people, including myself, approach the special forces selection course and preparation for it. And I think most people are very aware of the physical requirements, and I think that's where their emphasis is. But I think they're probably leaving a lot on the table, and I know I did, with regards to psychological preparation and also physiological preparation. And for any listener who's come across Wim Hof, who's the Iceman doing all his cold water immersion stuff, he's a Dutch bloke, and if you haven't heard of him and you're interested, have a look. But there's some pretty good evidence coming out now about cold water immersion, ice baths, and some of the physiological adaptation that you can get out of that. I think the gut biome is another area that's massively misunderstood, and another opportunity for people to really tap into another echelon of human performance, and the mindfulness, the meditation stuff, all this stuff that if someone had told me I'd be interested in 10 years ago, I would have probably laughed at them. That ketogenic diet and becoming fat adapted as opposed to running on carbohydrate, and the short-term performance benefits of that, but also the longer-term health benefits of putting less sugars into your system. So I think there's a whole bunch of very interesting facets of our physiology that people aren't tapping into, and I think is something that's really warrants further investigation. And when you look at particularly a special forces selection process where you've got already very, very fit, motivated young blokes, as a general rule, obviously women are now coming into the special forces selection process as well, and which is great to see. But when you look at the difference that 2, 3, 5% in performance, be it physical or psychological, can make, and I really think that we can unlock a bit more of our potential and not focus as much just purely on the physical, but start moving into these other modalities to improve human performance. And that could have a huge effect on a selection course, or on life in general, whatever you're striving towards.
I did a podcast not too long ago with Nikki Pepper, and it was about the basics of fitness, and she brought up Wim Hof, and I told her, I'll tell you too, I read somewhere that guy climbed Mount Everest in like a pair of shorts, nothing else.
Yeah, that's his thing. So I mean, he's the Wim Hof method is and I won't sort of go into any great detail, but it's some breathing techniques. It's a lot of cold exposure in different ways, and it's all about basically just tapping into these untapped reserves of human performance. And he does some phenomenal stuff with under ice swimming. He's got a couple of world records there, and also mountain climbing. And it's quite fascinating with his breathing techniques, which involve hyperventilation, so breathing faster than you feel the need to. And then he's got these breath holding exercises as well. And there's some decent science behind it, even though there seems to be a lot of voodoo associated with what he's doing as well, to be honest. But one of his big things, and something that he's repeatedly proven, not just by himself, but with diverse groups of individuals, is going up to high altitude in phenomenally quick times without periods of acclimatization at different altitudes, and using his breathing techniques to be able to overcome all that acute mountain sickness. And so there's some incredible case studies. He often takes groups to Kilimanjaro in Africa, and they'll summit it in 30 hours, whereas most people will take 6, 7, 8 days to get up to the top and give themselves plenty of time to acclimatize at the different altitudes. But more phenomenally, exactly as you said, they'll do it sort of half naked. They'll have a set of climbing boots and shorts on, and apparently old Wim Hof likes to just climb in a set of dick togs, just a Speedo, and not much else. And so it's phenomenal what he can do, and he's the extreme of that. And I think, it's been a couple of times where he's come very close to dying in trying to achieve things. But I think
really
I think he near drowned in one of his under ice swimming record attempts pretty early in his fame. His corneas froze over and he couldn't see, and luckily he had some rescue divers in the water, and one of them hauled him out. But So,
Oh my
you know,
God.
it is an extreme example, but I think there's room for most of us within the kind of limits of what's very safe to tap into some of what the Wim Hof's doing and just get a bit of extra human performance. And I think if nothing else, if you don't believe any of the hype surrounding the physiological adaptation of cold water immersion, and there's some decent evidence there. There's some fairly solid scientific data now. However, I think one of the big parts of it, and something that I enjoy about ice baths, is the actual mental discipline of forcing yourself into a bath full of ice, because it's something you desperately don't want to do, or hopping into a cold shower in the middle of winter. And it's as good a mental discipline as it is a physiological opportunity to adapt, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to have to give that a shot because because I heard that it's really, really good for you. What are the physiological effects of, like medically, of taking like a cold shower?
There's a couple of things. So, I mean, when you get exposed to extreme cold, which depending on what your climate is, a cold shower may or may not be, but ultimately, first of all, it gives your body a little bit of a shock, and so you get a bit of a dump of your stress hormones. So anything that pushes your body out of its normal parameters, out of its homeostasis, which are the boundaries that your body likes to operate within, and it's a whole bunch of different variables, but temperature is one of them. If you start pushing your body outside of those boundaries, those set parameters that it wants to be within, your body starts to react to that. And so when it's cold, for instance, say you hop in an ice bath that's down around 10 degrees Celsius, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but cold anyway, cold enough so that you hop in and it takes your breath away, then your body on a physiological level, it doesn't know that you're just in a bath and you can hop out at any time. So your cells don't understand that, and they know that if they stay in that cold water for any protracted period, that you will die, because that is well outside your boundaries. People falling into cold water, they have hypothermia, and it's a pretty quick death if it's freezing cold water and you can't get out in time or get saved. And so on a very basic level, your body starts to dump out a massive stress response and dumps all the stress hormones that your body might need to mount a fight or flight response to be able to get yourself out of that environment. And it does that thinking, hey, if we don't get out of this environment, we're going to be dead, so let's give everything we've got to be able to get us out of here. So you dump a whole stack of chemicals like adrenaline, so epinephrine, your stress neurotransmitters, dopamine, which is a feel-good neurotransmitter in your brain, gets dumped. You, on a physiological level, you start to shut down all your blood flow to your periphery, so you get a vasoconstriction, a massive constriction of the blood vessels in all your peripheries, your hands, your feet, everything. Your body starts to shunt blood to your vital organs to try and keep your core warm, so it shunts it all, and that gives your blood vessels a really good workout there. Your lymphatic system gets a good squeeze, and so that's a system that sort of parallels your veins and drains additional fluid that's leaked out of your blood vessels, which is a very normal process, but it drains additional fluid in the tissues back to your, dumps it back into your circulatory system. And so these are the things that are going on when you get in the cold there. And then it'll eventually, an ice bath will push you out of that homeostatic. Your body's core temperature will start to drop, and it's one of these things. It's a fine balance. You don't want to stick around too long in it. You can run into troubles in hypothermia. But then when you hop out, everything vasodilates again. So it's just like an intense workout for your body's vasculature. It's an intense dump of all these stress hormones that the studies suggest that if you do that periodically, if you do that long term, if you're stressing your system long term and having too much of the stress hormones, the cortisol and what have you, eventually your body will break down. But if you pulse it periodically, then you can actually get some benefits to that. And there's some decent studies that suggest that it benefits your immune system longer term. But short, sharp sort of stress responses in a very controlled fashion over long periods of time show these benefits.
What is the length of time that you would recommend being in an ice bath or, say, a cold shower?
Yeah, it's a decent question. I mean, minutes is the answer. I started off just having short blasts of cold water at the end of a normal shower, and so trying to stay under it for a minute, 3 minutes was the way I started. And then I just moved into having just pure cold showers morning and night. And admittedly, I'm in an Australian climate where it's not particularly cold. We don't get any snow. It never gets down below zero where I live. So that's to put perspective on it. The cold water isn't that cold where I'm at. And so I've moved into having ice baths where I don't actually measure the temperature of them. I just run a cold bath and dump 15 kilos of ice in it and then hop in. But a decent guide is when your body starts to shiver. So I tend to stay in between about 10 and 15 minutes, but certainly it depends how cold you've got it. If you've got a proper ice bath with circulating water, that really chills you down faster, and then you should be staying in, somewhere in the order of 1 to 3 minutes. But once your body starts to shiver, that's a good indicator that your core temperature is starting to drop and your body's shivering to try and warm itself back up. And so you don't want to push it too much past that unless you're sort of right into it and experienced. And certainly, you don't want to be pushing this, going and swimming in frozen lakes by yourself and all that sort of stuff. You've got to keep it safe, because sadly people have died and trying to practice Wim Hof's techniques. So it is about keeping it safe and being sensible, and just getting started with a bit of cold water in the shower and then working up to a bit of ice in your bath. But when you're starting to shiver and your toes are starting to go a bit numb, that's probably a decent point to think about getting out until you get right into it.
Yeah, because I don't want to be too hardcore, and I'm like sitting there, be like, come on, if Wim Hof can do this for 3 days, I can do this for 20 minutes. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I don't think any of us should aspire to try and Wim Hof. That man's an absolute freak of nature. But yeah, he sets the bar high. But I think there's something in that for all of us. I really do. I think it's a great discipline and something that people should try.
Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, man. And I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate what you've done for freedom and fighting for it, and your sacrifices that you've done for your country. You've done it for freedom, and I really believe in that. And I would like to thank you for your service and you coming on the show.
Yeah, no, cheers for that, Priya. I appreciate those kind words, mate. And I guess, like most people who've served, for me, it was a real privilege. It was a great honour, a really fantastic period of my time and a period of my life, and lots of fairly rich memories. And it's nice to be able to come on shows like yours and share a few of them. So thank you for having me.
Where can people find you on social media?
Instagram is where I'm most active, so Dan Pronk on Instagram. I've also got a profile on LinkedIn where I put up a few articles here and there, and so Instagram and LinkedIn is the best spots to find me.
Awesome, man. Well, once again, thank you for having me on the show, and that's all that we've got for everybody tonight. This is Dan and Mike out.